Imagine being offered the keys to the future. Not a vague prediction, but a detailed instruction manual for your nation's destiny. A guide to surviving every plague, every invasion, every civil war for the next 1,000 years. Now imagine refusing to pay the price. This was the choice faced by Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome. The story goes that one day, an old, withered woman appeared at his court. She was a stranger, carrying 9 ancient books. She offered to sell them to the king, claiming they contained the collected prophecies of the Sibyl of Cumae, an oracle who could see the threads of fate. But her price was astronomical, an insult to the king's power. He laughed her out of the palace. In response, the old woman calmly walked outside, built a fire, and threw 3 of the 9 books into the flames. She then returned and offered the king the remaining 6, for the exact same price. Tarquin, now furious and bewildered, refused again. He thought her mad. The woman simply turned, walked back to her fire, and burned 3 more books. Now only 3 remained. She approached the king one last time. 3 books, the last remnants of Rome's prophesied fate. The price? Still unchanged. A chilling realization dawned on the king. He was not dealing with a madwoman. He was in the presence of something divine, something terrifyingly real. He paid the full, original price for the last 3 books, and in doing so, saved what little was left of Rome's future. The old woman then vanished, never to be seen again. What was in those books? What secrets were so valuable that a king would pay a fortune for a fraction of the original text? That is the question that haunted Rome for centuries. Because these were not just books. They became the most powerful, most secret, and most dangerous documents in the entire Roman world. They were the Sibylline books, and for the next 500 years, they were Rome's ultimate emergency protocol. These weren't kept in a library. They were stored in a stone chest, deep within the vaults of the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, the very heart of Roman power. Access was forbidden. To read them without authorization, to copy their contents, to even speak aloud one of their prophecies, was a crime punishable by death. The sentence was brutal and archaic. The offender was sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, and thrown into the Tiber River. That's how terrified the Romans were of these prophecies falling into the wrong hands. They were only consulted in moments of absolute crisis. When a plague decimated the city, when mysterious omens appeared in the sky, when Hannibal and his elephants were crossing the Alps and threatening the very existence of the Republic, a special college of priests sworn to secrecy would descend into the vault. They would unroll the brittle, ancient pages and search for answers, for a ritual, a course of action, any divine instruction that could save them from annihilation. These books didn't just predict the future. They gave Rome the cheat codes to survive it. But who wrote them? Who was this Sibyl, this mysterious woman who held the fate of an empire in her hands? She wasn't just one person. In the ancient world, a Sibyl was a specific type of oracle. A woman believed to be a channel for a god, usually Apollo, the god of prophecy. They were scattered across the known world, from Greece to Libya to Persia, living in caves and remote shrines, uttering frantic, ecstatic prophecies that others would scramble to write down. The most famous, the one who allegedly sold the books to King Tarquin, was the Cumaean Sibyl, who lived in a cave near modern-day Naples. Legend says the god Apollo had fallen in love with her and offered her anything she desired. Pointing to a pile of dust, she asked for a year of life for every grain. Apollo granted her wish, but she had made a fatal mistake. She forgot to ask for eternal youth, and so she was cursed to live for 1,000 years, her body withering away until she was so small she could fit in a jar. Her voice the only thing left, endlessly whispering prophecies of what was to come. It was her collected life's work, her divine insight, that the Romans guarded so jealously. But the prophecies themselves were not what you might expect. They weren't straightforward predictions like, Rome will defeat Carthage in the year 202 BC. If they were, they would have been far too dangerous. Instead, they were written in complex, cryptic Greek poetry, filled with metaphors and allegories. They rarely told the Romans what would happen. They told them what to do when disaster struck. They were a divine playbook for appeasing angry gods. The fundamental Roman belief was in the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. As long as the gods were happy, Rome would prosper. But if they were offended, they would send plagues, famines, and military defeats as punishment. When strange events occurred, A cow speaking, a rain of stones, a temple struck by lightning. The Romans saw it as a breakdown in that divine peace. They were signs of celestial anger. That's when they turned to the books. The priests wouldn't find a solution themselves. They would search the cryptic verses for a passage that seemed to match the current crisis. Then, they would interpret that passage and present their recommendation to the Senate. The solution was almost always religious. The books would command them to perform a specific sacrifice, to hold a new festival, or most profoundly, to import a new god into the city. This power was not in the hands of generals or politicians. It was entrusted to a group of men known as the Quindecimviri Sacris Faciendis, the 15 men for performing sacred rites. Originally just 2, their numbers grew as Rome's power expanded. These were men from the highest echelons of Roman society, often former consuls, who held this position for life. Their role was a sacred trust, and their influence was immense. When they spoke, with the authority of the Sibyl behind them, even the most powerful senators had to listen. Their interpretations could shift foreign policy, introduce new cultural practices, and calm a panicked populace. They were the spiritual guardians of the Republic, the keepers of its ultimate fail-safe. One of the first recorded consultations shows exactly how this worked. In 399 BC, a terrible plague swept through Rome. The city was paralyzed with fear. The Senate, desperate, ordered the keepers of the books to seek guidance. After performing their secret rituals, the priests emerged from the temple vault with a shocking recommendation. The books commanded the Romans to perform a ceremony they had never seen before, a lectisternium. This was a Greek ritual, completely foreign to Roman tradition. The priests were to take statues of the gods Apollo, Latona, and Diana, along with Hercules, Mercury, and Neptune, lay them on lavish couches in the open, and offer them a feast, as if they were honored dinner guests. For 8 days, the entire city of Rome became a festival. Private citizens opened their homes, inviting strangers to eat with them, forgiving debts and releasing prisoners. It was a citywide act of hospitality, both human and divine, and it worked. The plague subsided. But think about what really happened here. The Sibylline books, a foreign text written in Greek, had just been used to introduce a foreign ritual and foreign gods into the heart of Roman religion. This wasn't a one-time event. Time and time again, the books would serve as a conduit, a way for Rome to absorb new ideas and new deities from the cultures it conquered, integrating them into its own and making the empire stronger, more adaptable. The books didn't just save Rome from crises, they actively shaped its religious and cultural identity. They were a tool for managing existential fear, a direct line to the divine when all mortal solutions had failed. But a plague was just the beginning. Soon, Rome would face an enemy that would bring it to the absolute brink of annihilation. A crisis so profound that the Sibylline solution would be far darker, demanding a sacrifice that was terrifyingly human. The year is 218 BC, and Rome's greatest nightmare has just crossed the Alps. His name is Hannibal Barca. He is not just a general. He is a force of nature, an oath personified. As a boy, his father, the great Carthaginian commander Hamilcar Barca, made him place his hand on a sacrificial altar and swear an oath to be an enemy of Rome for his entire life. It was a promise Hannibal intended to keep with fire and steel. While Rome controlled the seas, Hannibal did the unthinkable. He gathered an army of over 50,000 men, nearly 40 war elephants, and marched them from Spain across the Pyrenees through Gaul, and then up and over the frozen, treacherous peaks of the Alps. It was a military operation so audacious, so insane, that the Romans never believed it was possible. They were expecting a war in Spain or a naval invasion of Sicily. They were not expecting the boogeyman of the Republic to appear in their own backyard. Hannibal's army that descended into the Po Valley was a shadow of its former self, ravaged by starvation, frostbite, and battles with mountain tribes. But the men who survived were forged into a hardened core of veterans, loyal to one man and one man only. And in the first clashes with the legions, at the battles of the Ticinus and the Trebia, Hannibal gave the Romans a brutal lesson in tactics. He was faster, smarter, and more ruthless than any commander they had ever faced. But those were just opening skirmishes. The next year, at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal laid one of the most perfect ambushes in military history. On a foggy morning, he lured a massive Roman army, led by the consul Gaius Flaminius, into a narrow pass along the lake's shore. As the long Roman column marched blindly into the trap, Hannibal's forces descended from the hills. The Romans were pinned between the lake and the enemy. There was no battle line. There was no retreat. There was only slaughter. 15,000 Roman soldiers were killed, many driven into the lake to drown in their own armor. The consul himself was cut down. It was a complete and utter catastrophe. When news of Trasimene reached Rome, the city was gripped by terror. The historian Livy tells us that a crowd gathered in the forum, desperate for information. When the praetor finally mounted the rostrum, he uttered just 5 words: "We have been defeated in a great battle." The city fell into a state of profound mourning. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a sign. The gods were angry. Something was deeply fundamentally wrong. In the face of this existential threat, the Romans appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus. His strategy was controversial, earning him the nickname the Cunctator, or the Delayer. He refused to face Hannibal in open battle. Instead, he shadowed his army, launching small-scale raids, cutting off his supply lines, and waging a war of attrition. It was a smart, cautious strategy, but for the proud Roman people it was cowardly. They craved a decisive victory, a chance to crush this invader and restore their honor. By 216 BC, their patience had run out. They amassed the largest army Rome had ever put into the field. 8 legions, somewhere between 50 and 80,000 men. A force they believed was invincible. Under the command of 2 new consuls, they marched south to a dusty plain near a village called Cannae, determined to annihilate Hannibal once and for all. What happened at Cannae was not just a battle, it was a wound from which the Republic would never truly heal. Hannibal, with a smaller, more diverse army, performed a tactical miracle. He placed his weakest troops, the Gauls and Spanish, in a bulging crescent-shaped center. As the massive, deep Roman formation smashed into them, he allowed his center to slowly give way, to bend backward like a bow. The Romans, sensing victory, pushed deeper and deeper into the pocket, and then the trap sprang. Hannibal's elite African and Carthaginian infantry, positioned on the wings, wheeled inward, smashing into the exposed Roman flanks. At the same time, his superior cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts, circled around and slammed into the rear. The Roman army was completely surrounded. Packed shoulder to shoulder, they could barely lift their arms to swing a sword. The battle devolved into a methodical, industrial-scale slaughter that lasted for hours under the brutal Italian sun. By sunset, the field was a sea of blood and bodies. Roman history records that nearly 50,000 of their soldiers were killed, including one of the consuls and 80 men of senatorial rank. It was the single deadliest day in Roman history. The news of Cannae shattered Rome. The city was defenseless. Hannibal was just a few days' march away. This was the end. Panic, grief, and religious terror consumed the populace. Livy writes of women wailing in the streets, of families performing private rites in a desperate attempt to appease the gods. The very foundations of their world had crumbled. Their armies were gone. Their leaders were dead. Their gods had abandoned them. In this moment of ultimate crisis, when all military and political solutions had failed, the Senate turned to its final, most sacred resort, the Sibylline books. The keepers were summoned to the temple of Apollo. The ancient, cryptic scrolls were unrolled. They searched frantically for a prophecy, any divine guidance that could explain this disaster and offer a path to salvation. And they found one. The oracle was terrifyingly specific. The gods were enraged because a sacred vow had been broken. 2 Vestal virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta who were sworn to 30 years of chastity, had been unchaste. This was a sacrilege of the highest order, a pollution at the very heart of Rome's spiritual life. The fabric of the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, had been torn. The punishment for the Vestals was swift and brutal. They were buried alive. But even that was not enough to quell the divine fury unleashed by Hannibal. The books demanded more. They prescribed a ritual so ancient, so barbaric, and so profoundly un-Roman that it sent a shudder through the Senate. They were to perform a human sacrifice. This was their darkest taboo. Romans viewed human sacrifice as a hallmark of savage, uncivilized peoples like the Gauls or their Carthaginian enemies. To perform such an act was to become the very thing they despised. But the prophecy was clear. To purify the city and restore the favor of the gods, they had to bury alive 2 couples, 1 male and 1 female Greek, and 1 male and 1 female Gaul, in the Forum Boreum, the city's cattle market. Imagine the desperation. To save their civilization, they had to betray one of its core principles. The choice was between annihilation and abomination. They chose abomination. The victims were chosen. We don't know how, whether they were prisoners of war or slaves. They were led in a grim, silent procession to a stone vault that had been prepared underground. No prayers were said, no public rites performed. This was not an act of pride, but of shame and terror. The 4 living people were lowered into the vault, and it was sealed over them, leaving them to die in the darkness beneath the feet of the Roman people. They had paid the ultimate price, not just with the lives of 4 foreigners, but with the peace of their own soul. They had looked into the abyss and, in a desperate bid for survival, had embraced its darkness. The immediate panic in Rome began to recede, replaced by a cold, grim resolve. They would not surrender. They would rebuild their armies. They would fight Hannibal not with brute force, but with the slow, grinding patience of Fabius. But the act had been done. A line had been crossed. And while this dark ritual may have steeled their nerves for the long war ahead, it planted a seed of doubt in the Roman psyche. In their moment of greatest need, their own gods had demanded a foreign barbaric rite. This unsettling truth would linger, a quiet poison in the soul of Rome, raising a disturbing question. If their path to victory was paved with such horrors, what kind of people would they be when they finally reached its end? That question haunted the Roman psyche. They had won, yes. The Gauls were driven back. But the price was a piece of their soul. For a people who prided themselves on pietas, on duty to the gods, the state, and the family, this act of ritual murder was a deep spiritual wound. It proved that when the walls were closing in, when true existential fear took hold, their high-minded ideals could be sacrificed just as easily as those 4 poor souls buried beneath the marketplace. The Sibylline books had saved them, but they had also shown them a terrifying reflection of themselves in the process. A reflection of a people capable of anything to survive. For a time there was peace, well, Roman peace, which meant constant, grinding warfare on the frontiers as the Republic's influence spread like a stain across the Italian peninsula. The memory of the buried Gauls and Greeks faded, becoming a grim footnote, a story to make children shiver. The Sibylline books were returned to their stone chest beneath the temple of Jupiter, their power dormant, waiting. Rome grew powerful, confident, even arrogant. They were the masters of Italy. They had defeated the great King Pyrrhus. They had even fought and won a massive generation-defining war against the mighty naval empire of Carthage. They were untouchable. And then from the snowy peaks of the Alps, a nightmare descended. He came not with a wild, screaming horde, but with a disciplined, veteran army of mercenaries, African heavy infantry, and nimble Numidian cavalry. He came with elephants, monstrous beasts that trampled legionaries into the mud. He came with a strategic genius so profound, so alien to the Roman way of war, that it seemed like a form of dark magic. His name was Hannibal Barca, and he had sworn an oath on a bloody altar as a child to never be a friend of Rome. He intended to do more than just honor that oath. He intended to burn Rome to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. The Romans, in their arrogance, met him head-on, and they were annihilated. At the Battle of the Trebia, one consular army was effectively erased. The next year, at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal set one of the largest and most successful ambushes in military history. He trapped a Roman army of 30,000 men against the shore of the lake and slaughtered them in the morning mist. The consul was killed, and 15,000 Romans died with him. When news reached the city, the praetor simply stood in the forum and announced, "We have been defeated in a great battle." Panic, cold and absolute, gripped the city. This wasn't a Gallic raid. This was an invasion by a military mastermind who could not be beaten. The gods had clearly abandoned them. The state was cursed. Prodigies and portents were seen everywhere. Shields sweating blood, temples struck by lightning, bizarre animals born in the marketplace. The people were terrified, convinced that their doom was at hand. And in times of ultimate fear, the Senate always turned to the same place. The order was given. The Quindecimviri, the 15 keepers of the sacred prophecies, descended into the vault. With solemn ritual, they unrolled the ancient, brittle scrolls. The fate of the Republic rested on the cryptic verses written by the long-dead Sibyl. The city held its breath. What had they done wrong? What terrible price would the gods demand this time? The verdict was grim. The books declared that the gods were profoundly angry. The rituals were not being performed correctly. Vows had been broken. The very heart of the Roman state, its contract with the divine, was in jeopardy. To fix it, the prophecies demanded a series of sweeping religious acts. First, a grand public festival of prayer and sacrifice was to be held, offerings made not just to Jupiter, but to a whole pantheon of gods, their statues paraded through the streets on sacred couches in a ceremony called electisternium. But that was just the beginning. The books demanded a vow of staggering scale, something that would involve every man, woman, and child in Roman territory. It was called the Vers Sacrum, the sacred spring. The Roman people as one would vow to sacrifice to Jupiter every single animal born in the coming spring. Every calf, every lamb, every piglet. It was an awesome, desperate pledge. A promise to halt the cycle of life for an entire season, to give the gods the first fruits of an entire year, in exchange for the life of the Republic itself. And then came the most familiar and perhaps most unsettling prescription. Just as before, the books pointed to a foreign solution. To win the war, Rome had to import another foreign goddess. This time it was Venus Erycina, a deity from a temple on Mount Eryx in Sicily. But this wasn't just any foreign god. This was a goddess deeply associated with their mortal enemies, the Carthaginians, who had controlled that part of Sicily for centuries. The irony was suffocating. To defeat Hannibal, the Romans were being commanded by their own prophetic books to build a temple inside the city walls to a goddess their enemies revered. It was a stunning display of religious pragmatism. If the gods of your enemy are powerful enough to challenge you, then you must make them your gods. Power, not piety, was the ultimate goal. The Romans did it all. They held the festivals. They made the great vow of the sacred spring. They sent a delegation to Sicily to formally invite the goddess Venus Erycina to take up residence in their city. They did everything the Sibylline books commanded. They had reset their contract with the gods. Surely now their fortunes would turn. Surely now their legions would be victorious. With their spiritual house in order, the Romans marshaled the largest army they had ever put into the field. 8 legions, close to 90,000 men, under the command of 2 consuls. They marched south to confront Hannibal at a small village in Apulia called Cannae. They were confident, righteous, and divinely sanctioned. They were going to crush the Carthaginian invader once and for all. What happened next was not just a defeat, it was an apocalypse. Hannibal, outnumbered almost 2 to 1, executed a strategic masterpiece of such brutal perfection that it is still studied in military academies to this day. He allowed the massive Roman center to push his own line back, deliberately creating a crescent-shaped pocket. Then, as the legions pressed forward, drunk on their apparent success, he unleashed his superior cavalry on the Roman flanks, which folded in like a closing door. The trap was sprung. The massive Roman army was encircled, packed so tightly they could barely lift their arms to swing their swords. The slaughter lasted for 8 hours. It was not a battle. It was an industrial process of extermination. By sunset, the fields of Cannae were slick with the blood of 50, some say 70,000 Romans. One of the consuls lay dead, along with 80 senators who had been serving as officers. It was the single deadliest day in Roman history. An entire generation of its fighting men had been wiped out in one afternoon. When the news reached Rome, the city didn't just panic. It broke. All the rituals, all the sacrifices, the vow of the sacred spring, the new goddess, it had all been for nothing. The gods had taken their offerings and given them only death in return. The city fell into a state of collective hysteria. Women ran through the streets, tearing their hair and screaming. The wails of mourners echoed from every house. Unauthorized, panicked sacrifices were being made in the Forum, the very fabric of Roman society. Its stoic discipline and religious order was unraveling. Hannibal's army was now camped just a few days' march away. The city was defenseless. This was the end. In this moment of ultimate despair, with the enemy at the gates and the spirit of the people utterly shattered, the Senate turned to the only thing they had left. Once more, the priests descended into the darkness beneath the Capitol. Once more they unrolled the Sibylline books. After the greatest catastrophe in their history, what could the prophecies possibly demand of them now? What price was left for them to pay? The air in the vault was colder than the grave. For the priests, the quindecimviri, this was a familiar chill, but tonight it felt different. It felt final. Above them, Rome was a city in shock. a city drowning in a grief so profound it had silenced the entire forum. The news from Cannae had arrived not as a report, but as a shockwave tearing through families, extinguishing ancient bloodlines in a single bloody afternoon. 80,000 men gone. A consul dead. The legions, the very backbone of the Republic, shattered. Hannibal was no longer a distant threat. He was a specter at the gates, and every Roman felt his shadow fall across their door. In the streets, a desperate primal fear had taken hold. Public mourning was forbidden by the Senate in a frantic attempt to maintain order, but it was no use. The wails of women echoed from behind shuttered windows. Men walked the streets with the vacant stares of ghosts, seeing the faces of their lost sons, brothers, and fathers in every shadow. The gods, it seemed, had not just abandoned Rome. They had declared war upon it. This was not a mere military defeat. This was divine judgment. And so the priests unrolled the ancient, fragile scrolls. The Greek verses of the Sibyl, a language that felt both foreign and sacred, were their only hope. They were not looking for military strategy or tactical advice. They were looking for the root of the gods' anger. What great sin had Rome committed? What ritual had been neglected? What sacred law broken to warrant such a cataclysmic punishment? They chanted the verses, their voices low and steady, a fragile anchor in a storm of national despair. The smoke from the incense curled around the strange, spidery script, and as they translated the lines, a dreadful silence fell over the chamber. The answer they found was worse than any of them could have imagined. The books did not call for more temples. They did not demand grander games or 100 more bulls for the altars. The prophecy spoke of a profound pollution, a stain on the soul of Rome that could only be cleansed by an act of ultimate appeasement, an act so contrary to Roman law, to Roman identity, to everything they believed made them civilized, that it bordered on the unthinkable. The Sibylline books demanded human sacrifice. For the Romans, this was the ultimate taboo. It was the practice of barbarians, of the Gauls who had sacked their city centuries before, of their mortal enemies, the Carthaginians, who were said to appease their god Baal-Hamon by sacrificing their own children. To perform such a rite was to become the very thing they despised. It was an admission of utter, final desperation, a spiritual surrender. But the alternative was Hannibal, and the complete annihilation of the Roman world. The Senate, shaken to its core, convened in secret. The prophecy was read. The debate must have been agonizing. To sanction this act was to violate centuries of tradition, the mos maiorum, the ways of the ancestors. But the terror in the city was palpable. The fabric of society was tearing. If the people believed the gods demanded this price, who were they to refuse? The decision was made. The Republic would stoop to the level of its enemies to survive. They didn't choose Roman citizens. That was a line even they would not cross. Instead, the priests, guided by the cryptic verses, selected 2 Gauls, a man and a woman, and 2 Greeks, a man and a woman, representatives of their oldest and newest enemies. It wasn't just a sacrifice. It was a dark piece of political theater. They were taking the life force of their foes, a symbolic offering to turn the dark magic of the world back upon itself. The chosen location was the Forum Boarium, the cattle market, a place of commerce and life, now slated to become a stage for a grim, archaic ritual. Under the watchful eyes of the priests, a stone vault was constructed, just large enough to hold the 4 victims. They were not to be killed by the sword. Their blood could not be spilled by Roman hands. Instead, they were to be buried alive. Imagine the scene. The hushed crowd, the grim-faced senators, the priests chanting prayers that were more like incantations. The 4 captives, their faces etched with a terror we can barely comprehend, being led down into the pit. They were given a final token meal, a mockery of life before the stone was sealed over them, plunging them into eternal darkness beneath the bustling heart of the city. As the final stone was set in place, a collective shudder must have run through Rome. They had done it. They had paid the ultimate price. They had sacrificed a piece of their own soul to save the Republic. Now, did this dark ritual magically stop Hannibal's army? Of course not. Hannibal was still in Italy, a master of the battlefield, his veteran army seemingly invincible. The sacrifice wasn't a military solution. It was a psychological one. It was a spiritual tourniquet applied to a hemorrhaging nation. For the Roman people, the act served as a terrifying yet powerful reset. The gods' anger, they could now believe, had been appeased. The great sin had been expiated. The unbearable tension that had gripped the city finally broke. The panic subsided, replaced by a grim, hardened resolve. The sacrifice, as horrifying as it was, restored the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods. And in doing so, it restored the Senate's authority and the people's faith in their destiny. And this newfound spiritual stability allowed for a radical shift in strategy. Before Cannae, one man had argued for a different way to fight Hannibal, Quintus Fabius Maximus. He proposed a strategy of avoiding pitched battles at all costs, to shadow Hannibal's army, harass his supply lines, and wear him down through a war of attrition. A strategy of delay. It was smart, it was logical, and it was profoundly un-Roman. Romans met their enemies head-on. They fought with honor and courage in the open field. To do otherwise was seen as cowardice. Fabius was mocked, nicknamed the Cunctator, the Delayer. But after Cannae, after the prophecy, after the living burial in the Forum Boreum, cowardice was a luxury they could no longer afford. The Romans had already embraced the unthinkable in the spiritual realm. Now they were ready to embrace it in the military one. The Fabian strategy was adopted. The days of seeking glorious, decisive battle were over. The long, grinding, and ugly war of survival had begun. The Sibylline books had not offered a battle plan. They had offered a path back from the brink of psychological collapse. By demanding the most terrible sacrifice, they forced Rome to hit rock bottom, to confront the abyss. And in that darkness, staring into the void, the Roman Republic found the will to change, the will to adapt, and most importantly, the will to endure. Rome had paid its darkest price and found its resolve. But survival was not victory. Hannibal remained on Italian soil, a wound that would not heal. To finally drive him out, to defeat a monster of his genius, they would need more than divine favor and a strategy of delay. They would need a new kind of hero, a man with a plan so audacious, so contrary to all Roman tradition, that it would either save the Republic or shatter it forever. That man's name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he was not like the others. He was young, barely 25, a survivor of the butchery at Cannae who had rallied the broken remnants of the legions. Where the old men of the Senate saw only despair and caution, Scipio saw opportunity. He possessed a burning, almost unnerving self-confidence, an aura that made men believe he did not merely consult the gods, but conversed with them as equals. While Fabius Maximus preached patience, Scipio preached audacity. He argued that hiding behind Rome's walls, slowly bleeding men and resources while Hannibal roamed free, was not a strategy for victory. It was a strategy for a slow, agonizing death. The Roman psyche was shattered. The Sibylline books had been consulted, the foreign gods placated, even the grim ritual of human sacrifice had been performed. Yet, Hannibal remained, an undefeated specter haunting the Italian countryside. The divine favor promised by the priests felt distant, hollow. The Senate was paralyzed, locked in a bitter debate between the Fabian strategy of delay and the desperate cry for immediate, decisive action that had led to nothing but catastrophic defeat. Into this vacuum of leadership and hope stepped Scipio. He came before the Senate not with a plan to defeat Hannibal in Italy, but with an idea so radical it bordered on insanity. Forget Hannibal, he argued. Let him wither on the vine. The key to killing a great tree is not to chop at its trunk, but to sever its roots. And Carthage's roots, its lifeblood of silver and soldiers, were buried deep in Spain. Scipio proposed to take the war there. He would lead an army into the heart of Carthaginian territory, seize their wealth, and cut off the stream of reinforcements flowing to Hannibal. The old guard was aghast. Fabius Maximus, the Cunctator, the Delayer, saw it as the reckless gamble of a glory-seeking boy. To send a major army abroad while the greatest enemy in their history was camped just a few days' march from Rome? It was madness. It violated every principle of Roman strategic thought. The debate raged, fierce and bitter. Rome was fighting for its very existence, and this young upstart wanted to open a new front hundreds of miles away. It's here that the whispers of prophecy once again began to swirl through the city. The official records are silent, but later historians like Livy and Appian hint at it. Perhaps the Quindecimviri, the keepers of the Sibylline books, were consulted again. Or perhaps, in a city desperate for any sign of divine will, an older prophecy was re-examined, its cryptic verses suddenly seeming to point in a new direction. A prophecy that spoke not of defending the 7 hills, but of a fire to be fought with a greater fire, of a wound that could only be healed by striking the enemy's heart. Whether it was a new prophecy or a masterful political maneuver, Scipio seized upon this current of divine fatalism. He framed his Spanish campaign not just as a military strategy, but as the fulfillment of destiny. He spent long hours in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, emerging with a serene confidence that convinced the common people he was divinely inspired. He didn't just propose a plan, he presented himself as the instrument of the gods. The people, tired of the old men and their failures, roared their approval. They bypassed the hesitant Senate and, in a direct vote of the Assembly, granted Scipio the command in Spain. It was an unprecedented move, a sign that the old ways were breaking down under the strain of war. So Scipio sailed for Spain, with a small army and the heavy weight of Rome's future on his shoulders. What he found was a country dominated by 3 separate Carthaginian armies, each one larger than his own. The situation seemed hopeless, but Scipio wasn't planning a conventional war of pitched battles. He had a single audacious objective in mind: the enemy's capital in Spain, the fortress city of Carthago Nova. New Carthage was the key to the entire Iberian Peninsula. It was a treasure chest, holding the vast majority of Carthage's silver and gold. It was a storehouse packed with weapons, grain, and siege equipment. It was a prison, holding Spanish hostages who ensured the loyalty of the local tribes. And it was considered utterly impregnable. The city sat on a peninsula, protected on 2 sides by the sea and on a third by a large, shallow lagoon. Only a narrow isthmus connected it to the mainland, and this was guarded by massive walls and a heavily fortified citadel. To attack it would be suicide. But Scipio had seen something no one else had. Or rather, he had bothered to ask the questions no one else had. He spoke to the local fishermen. He learned their ways, their knowledge of the coast, and they told him a secret. The lagoon, which protected the city's western walls, was not a constant barrier. It was tidal. Every afternoon, the water level dropped dramatically, making it possible to wade across. The Carthaginians, so confident in their natural defenses, had left that section of the wall almost entirely unmanned. This was Scipio's moment. It was a plan that relied on perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and a touch of what could only be described as divine luck. He marched his army with blinding speed, covering the distance to New Carthage before any of the 3 Carthaginian armies even knew he was on the move. He arrived before the city and immediately launched a furious assault on the main gate across the isthmus. It was a loud, bloody distraction designed to draw every defender to the front. As the main battle raged, Scipio waited, watching the sun, watching the water. Then, as the tide began to recede, he addressed a hand-picked group of his finest soldiers. He told them that Neptune himself, the god of the sea, would fight for them. He pointed to the lagoon, where the water was now miraculously pulling back, exposing a muddy path to the base of the western wall. For the soldiers, it was a miracle, a sign. Their commander did not just lead them, he commanded the very elements. Fueled by a surge of religious fervor, they stormed into the water. They waded through the shallows, carrying scaling ladders, and reached the undefended wall. Within minutes, they were over the top, sowing chaos and panic inside the city. They fought their way to the main gate and threw it open from within, allowing the rest of the Roman army to pour into the streets. The city fell in a matter of hours. The victory was total. It was more than a victory. It was a revelation. In a single day, Scipio had captured the enemy's treasury, their armory, and their political leverage over the Spanish tribes. He treated the captured citizens and hostages with such magnanimity and respect that he won the loyalty of the very people Rome was fighting. He was demonstrating a new way to wage war, not just with swords, but with strategy, psychology, and a profound understanding of his enemy. News of the fall of New Carthage raced back to Rome. It was the first truly great news the city had heard in over a decade. The young man they had sent to Spain, the one Fabius called a reckless boy, had achieved the impossible. He had done it with a plan that seemed to defy military logic but was blessed by the gods. Scipio was no longer just a promising general. He was becoming a legend. His connection to the divine, once a matter of personal charisma, now seemed proven on the battlefield. The man who spoke with the gods had made the sea itself part for his legions. But Spain was only the beginning. Scipio had proven his strategy could work. He had crippled the Carthaginian war effort and built a power base of his own. But the ultimate threat, Hannibal Barca, the monster who had haunted Rome's nightmares for 15 years, was still on Italian soil. To truly end the war, to finally fulfill the destiny he so fervently believed was his, Scipio knew he couldn't just keep cutting off the serpent's limbs. He had to go for its head. And that meant doing the one thing no Roman had dared to attempt for a generation, taking the war to the shores of Africa itself. It was a plan born of audacious genius, or perhaps sheer madness. The Roman Senate was aghast. For 15 years Hannibal had been a specter haunting the Italian peninsula, a monster lurking just beyond the next hill. The fields were fallow, the villages burned. An entire generation of Roman men lay buried in the soil they had failed to defend. And now this young upstart, this Publius Cornelius Scipio, fresh from his victories in Spain, stood before them and proposed the unthinkable. He wanted to abandon the defense of Italy, to take Rome's last best legions, and sail for Africa. He wanted to knock on Hannibal's front door. To the old guard, men like the venerable Quintus Fabius Maximus, this was heresy. Fabius, the cunctator, the delayer, the man whose entire strategy was built on caution, on avoiding Hannibal at all costs, on slowly bleeding the Carthaginian war machine dry. He saw Scipio not as a savior, but as a reckless gambler willing to bet the entire republic on a single throw of the dice. He stood in the Senate, his voice heavy with the weight of years and the memory of countless Roman dead, and he thundered against the plan. He accused Scipio of ambition, of youthful arrogance. Why chase a phantom in Africa when the real monster was still in their backyard? To many, Fabius was the voice of reason. The trauma of Cannae was still a fresh, weeping wound. The thought of leaving Rome undefended, even for a moment, was a primal terror they could not shake. The debate raged, splitting the city in two. Was Scipio a visionary, or a fool destined to lead them to a final cataclysmic defeat? As the political battle reached a fever pitch, a wave of dark omens washed over Italy, turning the public's anxiety into outright panic. Temples were struck by lightning. A monstrous birth, an infant of indeterminate sex, was reported. A shower of stones rained down from a cloudless sky. To the deeply superstitious Romans, these were not random acts of nature. This was the universe screaming a warning. The gods were angry. The divine order was broken. The 15-year nightmare of Hannibal's presence had frayed the very fabric of their reality, and now it felt like it was about to tear completely. The people, terrified and exhausted, needed something more than just military strategy. They needed a sign. They needed divine reassurance that their world was not about to end. And so, as they had done so many times before in moments of ultimate crisis, the Senate turned to the keepers of fate. The decemviri were ordered to unroll the fragile, ancient scrolls, to consult the Sibylline books. The city held its breath. What cryptic verse, what forgotten rite, held the key to their salvation this time? The priests performed their secret rituals, their chants echoing in the hushed chamber as they searched the Greek hexameters for guidance. And what they found was one of the strangest, most specific, and most consequential prophecies in all of Roman history. The verses were clear. They spoke of a foreign enemy laying waste to the fields of Italy, and they offered a solution. This enemy, it was foretold, could be driven out and conquered if the Magna Mater, the Great Mother, was brought from her sacred home in Pessinus all the way to Rome. Who was the Great Mother? She was an ancient, powerful, and distinctly non-Roman deity, a Phrygian goddess from the heart of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The Romans knew her as Cybele. She was a goddess of mountains, of nature, of wild, untamable fertility, often depicted with lions at her side. Her worship was ecstatic, primal, and frankly, a little terrifying to the buttoned-up, orderly Romans. But the books were unambiguous, and the prophecy wasn't just about bringing a concept or a statue to Rome. No, the physical embodiment of the goddess herself had to make the journey, and that embodiment was not a golden idol or a marble sculpture. It was a rock, a small conical black meteorite that had fallen from the heavens centuries before, and was worshipped as the living heart of the goddess Cybele. Suddenly, Scipio's war plans were entangled in a divine quest for a magic stone. The situation was desperate enough that no one questioned the absurdity. The Senate immediately organized a special embassy, a delegation of Rome's most distinguished men, and dispatched them on the perilous journey across the Mediterranean. Their destination was the kingdom of Pergamum, whose ruler, King Attalus I, was an ally of Rome and the current guardian of the sacred stone. Imagine the scene. Roman senators, men of law and war, arriving in an opulent Hellenistic court, not to negotiate a treaty or secure grain, but to humbly ask for a holy rock. They explained their plight, the endless war, the terrible omens, the prophecy from their sacred books. King Attalus, perhaps seeing the strategic benefit of placing the mighty Roman Republic in his debt, agreed. He led them to the shrine at Pessinus, and the black stone, the Idaean mother, was handed over to the Romans. The journey back was fraught with tension. The ship carrying the stone was a vessel of hope, but also of immense anxiety. What if it was lost at sea? What if the goddess was offended? As the ship finally entered the mouth of the Tiber River, the entire city of Rome poured out to greet it. This was not a military triumph. It was a spiritual deliverance. But the prophecy had one final, crucial condition. The goddess had to be officially welcomed to Rome and carried to her new home in the Temple of Victory by the Optimus Vir, the best man in the entire city. This was no small honor. It was a judgment on a man's entire character, his piety, his virtue, his service to the state. Who was this paragon? The Senate deliberated, and their choice fell upon a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio Nazica. He was a decorated soldier, a man of impeccable reputation, and in a twist that could not have been a coincidence, he was the cousin of Scipio Africanus himself. The fate of the Scipio family was now inextricably linked with the fate of this new goddess. So, as the crowds watched in reverent silence, Scipio Nazica waded into the Tiber. The most virtuous matrons of Rome passed the sacred stone from hand to hand, from the ship to the shore, where Nazica formally received it. He then carried the strange, dark meteorite through the streets, a procession of the entire city trailing behind him, and placed it within the Temple of Victory on the Palatine Hill. For the first time in over a decade, a wave of genuine hope swept through Rome. The omens had been answered. The prophecy was being fulfilled. The gods, it seemed, were once again on their side. And with the Great Mother safely installed, with divine favor seemingly secured, all eyes turned back to the man whose audacious plan had set this all in motion. Scipio Africanus now had his legions. He had the grudging consent of the Senate, and now he had the backing of a prophecy and a powerful new goddess. The spiritual and psychological weight had shifted. The invasion of Africa was no longer just a desperate military gamble. It was now an act of destiny, a divinely sanctioned mission to finally, once and for all, drive the monster from their lands by striking at his very heart. The immense pressure of a 15-year war, and the hopes of an entire civilization, now rested squarely on his shoulders. And so, in 204 BC, Publius Cornelius Scipio landed on the shores of North Africa. This wasn't just an invasion. It was a pilgrimage of righteous fury. Every Roman soldier who stepped onto that beach carried more than a gladius and a scutum. They carried the collective trauma of a generation. They carried the ghosts of Cannae and Trasimene. And they carried the unshakable belief, gifted to them by the Sibylline books, that the gods were finally, unequivocally, on their side. The Great Mother Cybele was now housed on the Palatine Hill, her black stone a silent testament to a promise made in the heavens. Now, it was Scipio's job to collect on that promise on the battlefield. He wasn't facing Hannibal. Not yet. Hannibal was still in Italy, a caged lion still dangerous but contained. Scipio's immediate targets were the Carthaginian forces and their Numidian allies who were defending the homeland. And from the very beginning, Scipio demonstrated a kind of strategic genius that seemed almost supernatural. He wasn't just a general. He was an artist of war, and the African landscape was his canvas. He laid siege to the city of Utica, a key Carthaginian port. The siege dragged on, and as winter approached, the Romans were forced into a stalemate. The Carthaginian general Hasdrubal Gisco and his Numidian ally, King Syphax, had set up two massive, separate camps nearby, boxing Scipio, Indiana. They had him outnumbered, and they were content to wait him out. It was a classic, fatal miscalculation. They assumed Scipio was a conventional Roman general. They had no idea they were dealing with a man who thought in terms of fire and fear. Scipio received intelligence that the two enemy camps were built largely of wood, reeds, and wicker, highly flammable materials. A plan began to form in his mind, a plan of such audacious, terrifying cruelty that a lesser man would have dismissed it as impossible. He entered into fake peace negotiations with Syphax, sending envoys back and forth. But his envoys weren't just diplomats. They were spies dressed as servants, meticulously mapping the layouts of both camps, noting the watch patterns, the locations of the sentries, everything. Then, on a moonless night, Scipio divided his army. He sent one of his most trusted legates, Gaius Laelius, along with his Numidian ally Massinissa, a rival to Syphax, to attack Syphax's camp. Scipio himself would lead the assault on the main Carthaginian camp. The plan was not to fight. The plan was to burn. Massinissa's men, familiar with the layout of a Numidian camp, slipped past the sentries and set fire to the reed huts at multiple points simultaneously. The dry material erupted in a hurricane of flame. The sleeping Numidians awoke not to a battle cry, but to the roar of an inferno. They stumbled out of their tents, unarmed, half-naked, blinded by smoke and panic. They thought it was a tragic accident. Many were trampled in the stampede. Others were consumed by the flames. Those who managed to escape the fire ran blindly into the darkness, straight into the waiting lines of Roman soldiers who cut them down without mercy. In the Carthaginian camp, Hasdrubal's men saw the fire and, just as Scipio predicted, assumed it was an accidental blaze in their allies' camp. Some even began to leave their own fortifications unarmed to go and help. That's when Scipio gave his order. The Roman torches descended upon the second camp. The scene repeated itself. A symphony of horror played out on a massive scale. The Carthaginians, trapped between the burning camp behind them and Scipio's legions in front of them, were annihilated. Polybius, the ancient historian, claims that 40,000 men were killed that night, with thousands more captured. In a single terrifying masterstroke of deception and pyromania, Scipio had effectively erased Carthage's entire home army from the map. The sheer psychological devastation was immeasurable. This wasn't a defeat. It was a divine judgment delivered by fire and steel. The news hit the city of Carthage like a physical blow. The invincible monster they had sent to ravage Italy was still abroad, but their own home was now defenseless. The walls of their great city, which had not seen an enemy army for centuries, now looked thin and fragile. The Roman wolf was at the door. Panic gripped the Carthaginian Senate. There was only one option left. One name that could possibly save them. The order was sent. Recall Hannibal. Imagine that moment. For 15 years, Hannibal Barca had been the master of Italy. He had marched its length and breadth, leaving a trail of broken legions and terrorized citizens. He had become a myth, a boogeyman Roman mothers used to frighten their children. Italy was his chessboard, and he had played a masterful, if ultimately unwinnable, game. And now he was being told to come home, not as a conqueror but as a last desperate defense. He was being forced to abandon the singular obsession of his entire adult life. The historian Livy describes him receiving the news, grinding his teeth and groaning, barely able to hold back tears of rage. He accused the Carthaginian Senate of cowardice, of pulling him back not out of necessity, but out of jealousy of his glory. He had been so close. He had brought Rome, the great power of the West, to its very knees, but he had never been able to deliver the final killing blow. As his ships pulled away from the Italian coast, he is said to have looked back at the land he had dominated for so long and cursed the gods and men who had denied him his ultimate prize. And for Rome? The moment Hannibal's last soldier left Italian soil was a moment of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. The prophecy of the Sibylline books had been fulfilled to the letter. They had brought the Great Mother to Rome, and the foreign enemy had been driven from Italy's shores. It was a vindication of their faith, a confirmation that their suffering had a purpose, that their piety had been rewarded. The national nightmare was over. The monster was gone, but the war was not. Hannibal landed in Africa, a king returning to a kingdom on the verge of collapse. He quickly assembled a new army, a motley collection of raw recruits, mercenaries, and the veterans he had brought with him from Italy, the hardened survivors of a decade and a half of constant warfare. These were the men who had stood with him at Cannae, men who knew no other life than following him into battle. Scipio, now hailed as a hero back in Rome, knew this was the final act. All his victories in Africa, all the political maneuvering, all the divine prophecies, it had all led to this. A collision was now inevitable. Two of the greatest military minds in human history were now operating on the same continent, marching towards each other. Before the final cataclysmic battle, the two men met, face to face between their two armies. It's one of the most dramatic encounters in all of history. Hannibal, the aging, one-eyed veteran, a legend forged in blood and victory. Scipio, the young, brilliant challenger, the chosen one of Rome, riding a wave of success and divine favor. They spoke of terms of peace, but they both knew it was a formality. There would be no peace. One of them had to be broken. One civilization had to fall. As they parted, the stage was set. Near a town called Zama, the fate of the Mediterranean would be decided in a single day. On one side, Hannibal and his war elephants, the beasts that had crushed Roman legions in the Alps. On the other, Scipio, armed with new tactics, unwavering confidence, and the belief that the gods of Rome, guided by the Sibylline prophecies, had preordained his victory. The sun was about to rise on the most important battle in Roman history, a clash that would determine the course of Western civilization for the next 1,000 years. October 28, 312 AD. The air over the Tiber River is thick with a cold, damp mist, and the nervous energy of two massive armies poised for slaughter. On one side, inside the supposedly impregnable Aurelian walls, is Maxentius. He is the master of Rome, confident, perhaps even arrogant. He holds the city, he has superior numbers, and most importantly, he has the favor of the gods. He had consulted the keepers of the Sibylline books. The sacred verses had been unrolled, the ancient Greek hexameter deciphered, and the prophecy was clear, almost laughably so. It read that on this very day, the enemy of the Romans would perish. For Maxentius, the meaning was obvious. He was in Rome. He was the Roman emperor, defending the sacred heart of the empire. Constantine was the outsider, the invader, the enemy at the gates. The Sibyl had spoken. Victory was not just possible, it was preordained. He ordered his men to march out of the city, to cross the Tiber over the sturdy Milvian bridge and a hastily constructed pontoon bridge of boats beside it, to meet the enemy in the open field. It was a display of supreme confidence, a gesture to the gods that he trusted their word implicitly. On the other side of the river, Constantine watched the enemy army deploy. He was outnumbered, far from his power base in Gaul and Britain, and facing an opponent dug into the most fortified city on earth. By every conventional military calculation, this was a foolish, almost suicidal gamble. But Constantine was not operating on conventional calculations. He was operating on a vision. The story, told and retold for centuries, is that the day before, as he contemplated the impossible odds, Constantine looked towards the setting sun and saw a cross of light above it.
And with it, the gerts nitutnica, in Greek or in Latin, in hoc signo vinces.
In this sign you will conquer. Later that night, in a dream, he was commanded to make a heavenly sign and use it as a safeguard in all his battles. This was not the cryptic, ambiguous poetry of the Sibyl, open to a dozen self-serving interpretations. This was a direct command, a new prophecy from a new and powerful source. When dawn broke, Constantine gave an order that must have sent a shockwave of disbelief and terror through his own ranks. He commanded his soldiers to alter their shields, to paint over the eagles the lightning bolts of Jupiter, the symbols of Mars, the entire pantheon that had marched with the legions for centuries. And in their place they were to paint a new symbol, a monogram of the first two Greek letters in the name Christos, Chi and Rho, one superimposed on the other, the Chiro. Imagine being a Roman soldier that morning. For your entire life, you have prayed to Jupiter for strength, to Mars for courage. You have made sacrifices at their temples. You know that the fate of Rome itself is tied to the proper worship of these gods, a sacred contract maintained through rituals guided by prophecies like those of the Sibylline books. And now, on the eve of the most important battle of your life, your commander is telling you to erase those gods from your shield and replace them with the symbol of a strange, Eastern mystery cult. A cult whose followers were, until very recently, being systematically persecuted and executed by the state you serve. It was an act of mass blasphemy, a terrifying gamble that risked angering the very gods Maxentius was so sure he had on his side. But Constantine's conviction was absolute. His men, loyal to him after years of successful campaigns, obeyed. As the two armies clashed on the Saxa-Rubra plains, something extraordinary happened. Constantine's smaller veteran force, fighting with a strange, desperate fervor under their new emblem, began to push Maxentius's larger army back. The fighting was brutal, a chaotic swirl of steel and blood, but Constantine's cavalry, his greatest strength, smashed into the enemy flank, shattering their lines. Panic began to ripple through Maxentius's troops. The retreat became a rout. Thousands of soldiers funneled back towards the only two escape routes, the Milvian Bridge and the temporary boat bridge beside it. The scene descended into pure chaos. Men, horses, and armor pressed onto the bridges in a desperate stampede. The pontoon bridge, never designed to hold the weight of a panicked, retreating army, groaned, buckled, and then collapsed. Hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers in heavy armor were pitched into the churning waters of the Tiber, dragged to the bottom to drown. In the midst of the pandemonium, Maxentius himself was forced back with his Praetorian Guard. Pushed by the tide of his own routing men, he was forced onto the collapsing bridge. Thrown into the river, the weight of his own magnificent armor, the very symbol of his imperial authority, became his anchor. He drowned in the muddy waters of the Tiber. The next day, his body was fished out of the river. His head was severed and paraded on a spear for all of Rome to see as Constantine made his triumphal entry into the city. There was no doubt. The prophecy of the Sibylline books had come true, with a brutal, literal precision that no one could have anticipated. On that day, the enemy of the Romans had perished. But the great cosmic irony was that the enemy was not the man outside the walls. It was the tyrant within. Maxentius, in his hubris, had so thoroughly identified himself with Rome that he couldn't imagine a reality where he could be its enemy. He read the prophecy through the lens of his own ego, and in doing so, walked directly into its trap. He marched his army out of an impregnable fortress to fulfill a prophecy that was actually about his own destruction. The Sibylline verses, true to their ancient and mysterious nature, had not lied. They had simply allowed a man to be destroyed by his own interpretation of them. This was more than just a change of emperor. It was a cataclysmic shift in the spiritual landscape of the Western world. For 800 years, when Rome faced its darkest hours, it had turned to the cryptic utterances of a long-dead prophetess, interpreted by a college of priests. The Sibylline books were the ultimate authority, the direct line to the divine will that guaranteed the survival and destiny of Rome. But now, a Roman emperor had won the decisive battle for control of the empire not by sacrificing to Jupiter, not by consulting the Sibyl, but by painting the symbol of the Christian God on his shields. He had rejected the entire religious framework that the books represented, and had been rewarded with a spectacular, history-altering victory. The foundation had cracked. The old ways, the old gods, and the old prophecies suddenly seemed weak, ambiguous, and impotent compared to the direct, powerful intervention Constantine had seemingly received. A new power was rising. A power that didn't whisper in cryptic verses but spoke in visions of fire in the sky. The Sibylline books, for centuries the sacred guardians of Rome's fate, were now facing their own existential crisis. What place was there for these pagan prophecies in an empire that was about to be remade in the image of a cross? The question hung in the smoke-filled air of a changing world. It was a war fought not with legions and swords, but with ideas and faith, for the very soul of the empire. The cross was ascendant, a symbol of radical, exclusive devotion to a single all-powerful God. And in the shadow of that cross, the old ways began to wither. The Sibylline books, once the ultimate authority, the final arbiter of Rome's destiny, were now relics of a faith under siege. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping irrelevance. When Constantine the Great saw his vision of the cross in the sky and converted to Christianity, he didn't immediately order the pagan temples shuttered or the ancient scrolls burned. The old institutions were too deeply woven into the fabric of Roman life. The Quindecimviri still existed. The temple of Apollo Palatinus still stood. But their power, their necessity began to fade. Why consult the cryptic verses of a pagan priestess when you could pray to the one true God? Why seek earthly salvation through ritual when the new faith promised eternal salvation for the soul? The consultations grew less frequent. The state, which once saw the books as its lifeline, now viewed them with a mixture of suspicion and embarrassment. For a Christian emperor, to be seen consulting pagan prophecies was a political liability. It was an admission that their new God was perhaps not all-sufficient. And so the books sat in their golden chest, gathering dust, their silence growing louder with each passing year. They had guided Rome through Hannibal, through social wars and civil strife, but now they faced a threat they could not have prophesied, being ignored. Yet the old faith did not die quietly. It had its champions, men who saw the abandonment of the gods not as progress, but as a fatal act of cultural suicide. The greatest of these was a man named Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, one of the last great pagan senators of Rome. He was brilliant, eloquent, and deeply pious. He looked at the state of the empire in the late 4th century, barbarians at the gates, political instability, economic decay, and he saw a direct connection to Rome's abandonment of its divine protectors. His battleground was the Curia, the Senate house itself. At its center stood the altar of victory, a golden statue of the goddess who had guided Roman legions for centuries. For Symmachus, this altar was the physical embodiment of the pact between Rome and the heavens. It was a symbol of the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods that had made Rome great. But to the powerful Christian faction, led by the formidable Bishop Ambrose of Milan, it was an idol, an abomination that could not be tolerated in a Christian empire. The Christian Emperor Gratian had it removed. Symmachus was outraged. He penned a passionate, desperate plea to the emperor, an argument that resonates even today. He didn't argue for the truth of one religion over another. He argued for tradition, for respect, for the soul of Rome itself. "We ask for peace for the gods of our fathers, the native gods of Rome," he wrote. "We all look up at the same stars. We are all fellow travelers on the same planet. We all gaze at the same sky. What does it matter what path we take to find the ultimate truth? The heart of so great a mystery can never be reached by one road alone." It was a beautiful, tolerant plea for a pluralistic past. But it was an argument out of time. Bishop Ambrose fired back with theological fury, threatening the emperor with excommunication. The appeal failed. The altar of victory was not restored. This was more than just the removal of a statue. It was a verdict. The old pact was broken. The gods of Rome were officially retired. And if the altar that symbolized that pact was irrelevant, what did that mean for the Sibylline books, the very text of that agreement? They were no longer just ignored. They were now the symbols of a defeated ideology. The final blow came not from a theologian or an emperor, but from a general. His name was Flavius Stilicho. He was a Vandal, a barbarian by birth, who had risen through the ranks to become the most powerful man in the Western Roman Empire, the guardian of the young emperor Honorius. Stilicho was a Christian, but more than that, he was a pragmatist. He saw an empire crumbling at the seams, and he needed absolute unity. The lingering pagan aristocracy, with their secret rites and their nostalgia for the old gods, were a threat to that unity. They whispered that Rome's troubles were punishment for abandoning the faith of their ancestors. And their ultimate source of authority, the last great symbol of their dying religion, was the Sibylline books. In 408 AD, Stilicho made a fateful decision. He declared the books to be a source of sedition, a tool for political dissent against the Christian state. He ordered them to be taken from their sanctuary in the Temple of Apollo and to be burned. Imagine that day. Soldiers marching up the Palatine Hill, not to defend Rome, but to dismantle its spiritual heart. The Quindecimviri, the keepers of the faith, watching helplessly as their sacred charge, guarded for centuries, was carried out into the light. There was no grand ceremony, no public spectacle. It was a quiet, brutal act of political and cultural cleansing. The scrolls, fragile with age, containing the accumulated wisdom and terror of 1,000 years of Roman history, were thrown onto a pyre. The prophecies that had saved the city from Gauls and Carthaginians, that had calmed plagues and ended civil wars, curled into ash and smoke. The voice of the Sibyl, which had echoed in the ears of kings and consuls, was finally silenced. It was a bonfire of a millennium. With the flames, the direct line between Rome and its divine destiny was severed. The city was on its own. The pagans who witnessed this were horrified. They saw it as the ultimate sacrilege, an act of such profound arrogance that divine retribution was not just likely, but inevitable. The poet Rutilius Nemesianus lamented the act, blaming Stilicho for destroying the pledge of Rome's fate. He believed that by burning the books, Stilicho had rendered Rome defenseless, blinding the city to its own future. He didn't have to wait long to be proven right. Just 2 years later, in the summer of 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. For the first time in 800 years, the walls of Rome were breached by a foreign enemy. The Visigoths, led by their king, Alaric, poured into the Eternal City. For 3 days they sacked it, looting its treasures, burning its buildings, and shattering the illusion of its invincibility. The The psychological shock was immense. It was the 9/11 of the ancient world. How could this happen? How could the capital of the world, the city protected by gods and history, fall to a barbarian horde? For the remaining pagans, the answer was terrifyingly simple. In 408, Rome burned the words of its gods. In 410, the gods let Rome burn. The contract had been violated, and the punishment was swift and devastating. The silence from the Temple of Apollo was answered by the screams from the streets of the city. The fate the books were meant to avert had finally come to pass, precisely because they were no longer there to be consulted. The Sibylline books were gone, reduced to ash and memory. Their story, it seemed, was over. But the power of prophecy is a stubborn thing, and the legend of the Sibyl was far too powerful to be extinguished by a single fire. The physical scrolls may have been destroyed, but the idea of them, the ghost of their authority, would linger. It would be twisted, co-opted, and reborn in the most unexpected ways, by the very faith that had sought to destroy it. The final prophecy of the Sibylline books was one they never contained: their own strange and remarkable afterlife. The ashes of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus were not the end of the Sibyl. They were a transformation, a name, an idea, a vessel of authority so powerful that it could not be contained by a single religion or a single set of scrolls. The very people who saw the books as a demonic pagan relic would become the unlikely custodians of their legend. Because you don't just destroy a symbol of ultimate truth, you try to claim it as your own. Early Christian thinkers faced a dilemma. The Sibyls were famous. Their prophecies were legendary, woven into the very fabric of the classical world they were trying to convert. To simply dismiss them was to ignore a potent cultural force. So they did something brilliant. They didn't deny the Sibyl's power. They recontextualized it. They argued that God, in his infinite wisdom, had granted glimpses of the future not only to the Hebrew prophets but to certain virtuous pagans as well. The Sibyls, they claimed, were unwitting prophets of Christ. The key piece of evidence was a text that every educated Roman knew by heart, the fourth eclogue of the poet Virgil. Written decades before the birth of Jesus, Virgil spoke of a new age of gold, ushered in by the birth of a miraculous child who would wash away the sins of the world. He wrote of a virgin and a serpent being crushed. For Virgil and his contemporaries, this was likely a poetic ode to the hoped for peace under Augustus, perhaps referencing a child of the imperial family. But for Christians reading it centuries later, the language was electric. A virgin? A child who removes sin? This wasn't about Augustus. This was about Jesus. And where did Virgil claim to have heard of this prophecy? He explicitly credited a Sibylline verse from Cumae. Suddenly, the Cumaean Sibyl wasn't a pagan priestess. She was a proto-Christian saint, a witness to the coming Messiah. Church fathers like Lactantius and even St. Augustine of Hippo quoted the Sibyls to prove the truth of Christianity to a pagan audience. The logic was powerful. Look, even your own most revered prophetess foretold the coming of our Lord. We are not destroying your world. We are fulfilling its deepest and most secret prophecies. The enemy's greatest weapon was reforged and turned back against them. The Sibyl was baptized in Christian ink. But this co-opting went far beyond mere interpretation. If the original books were gone, why not create new ones? And so, a new collection of texts began to circulate, known as the Sibylline Oracles. These were not the Roman state secrets. They were forgeries, brilliant and audacious works of religious propaganda. Written over centuries, first by Hellenistic Jews and later by Christians, they adopted the poetic style and the authoritative voice of the ancient Sibyl to promote their own beliefs. These new oracles were a world away from the Roman originals. They didn't offer rituals to appease angry gods. Instead, they spoke of a single, all-powerful God. They railed against idolatry, mocked the Roman pantheon, and predicted apocalyptic fire and brimstone for the sinful empire. They foretold the coming of a Messiah, described the end of the world, and laid out a vision of history that culminated not in the glory of Rome, but in the final judgment of God. They were, in essence, the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation dressed in a pagan toga. By putting these words in the mouth of the Sibyl, they gave their message an ancient, undeniable authority that it otherwise would have lacked. They were hacking the Roman mind, using its most trusted source of wisdom to deliver a virus of monotheism. And it worked. The legend of the Sibyl didn't just survive the fall of Rome. It thrived. Through the Dark Ages and into the Middle Ages, she became a fixture of Christian tradition. She was the one pagan who knew. While the rest of her world worshipped stone and myth, she had seen the true light. This culminated in one of the most astonishing sights in all of Western art. Look up at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. There, painted by the hand of Michelangelo, are the great prophets of the Old Testament: Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, the men who spoke the word of God. And right there among them, given equal size, equal prominence, and equal majesty, are 5 pagan Sibyls: the Delphic Sibyl, the Erythraean Sibyl, and of course the Cumaean Sibyl, staring out with an expression of divine and terrible knowledge. In the very heart of Christendom, on the ceiling of the Pope's private chapel, these pagan women sit as honored witnesses to God's plan. There could be no greater testament to the endurance of their legacy. They had been fully absorbed into the Christian story. So what then is the final legacy of the Sibylline books? After all the fires, the politics, the forgeries, and the reinterpretations, what are we left with? The story of the books is ultimately not about predicting the future. It's about the desperate, timeless human need to control it. Rome was a civilization built on order, law, and process. Yet its people knew they were at the mercy of forces far beyond their command. Famine, plague, barbarian invasions, the sheer terrifying randomness of fate. The Sibylline books were their answer to that terror. They were a psychological release valve for an entire civilization. They were the ultimate admission that sometimes the rational, legalistic Roman way was not enough. Sometimes you needed something more. You needed a sacred instruction manual, a direct line to the divine. The belief that a solution to any crisis could be found within those cryptic verses gave the Roman people a sense of agency when they felt most helpless. It was a system for managing chaos. The power was never truly in the words themselves, which were so famously obscure. The real power was in their interpretation. The College of Priests, the Quindecimviri, were some of the most influential men in Rome. They held the keys. When the state was in peril, all eyes turned to them. And by selecting, editing, and presenting a specific verse, they could shape the national response. They could justify a war, calm a panicked mob, or introduce a new god. The books were a tool of statecraft disguised as religion, a way to channel public anxiety and rally the people behind a chosen course of action. In the end, the life cycle of the Sibylline books perfectly mirrors the life cycle of Rome itself. It begins in the mists of legend, with a mysterious old woman and a stubborn king. It grows to become the sacred heart of the Republic, a source of stability and divine guidance. It witnesses the transition to empire, surviving the flames of civil war and chaos, only to be painstakingly reconstructed by Augustus. And finally, it is extinguished by the rise of a new faith, a new world order that sees it as a relic of a superseded age. The story of the books is the story of Rome. Today, nothing of the original books remains. Not a single confirmed line. Not a fragment of a scroll. They are gone utterly and completely. We will never know the prophecies that calmed a fearful city, or the rituals that were performed to save the Republic. They exist now only as a ghost, a rumor whispered through the histories of Livy and Tacitus. And perhaps that is their final, most profound prophecy. Their complete and total absence. The books leave us with a question that every civilization, and every one of us, must eventually face. What do you do when the sacred texts are silent? What happens when the guide to the future has been burned? The Romans showed us the answer. You remember them. You idealize them. And if you have to, you rewrite them. You create a new story to make sense of the chaos. The physical books are lost to the ashes of history, but the human need for them, the need for answers, for meaning, for a guiding voice in the storm, that is eternal. The Sibyl is no longer speaking, but we, it seems, never stop listening for her voice.